So first of all, please make sure you adjust your motivation, thinking, I want to reach a state of full and complete enlightenment for the sake of benefiting all other sentient beings who are as vast as the vastness of space. And it is for this reason that I'm coming here to attend these teachings that summarize the essence of all the Buddha's teachings. Okay, so we have already talked about death and impermanence. We have talked about having obtained the precious human rebirth. But even though we might have obtained this type of rebirth, if you see amongst humans, there are not many people who live to up to the age of 100 or even past 100. We might have the great aspiration or the great wish that says, I will live a very long life, or we keep thinking that I will have a long life. However, things do not always turn out according to our wishes. Of course, there are certain individuals who have the merit and they make the prayers, and as a result of this, they have established longer life. But for the majority of us, it's like we do not have such long lives. If you are born, it is definite that you will have to experience the death. So we must all die. This is certain. However, the specific time of death is uncertain. If someone were to ask you, will you live for another year? Will you live for another 5 years, 10 years? We cannot possibly give such a guarantee. So the thing that we have to consider is definitely we will die, but we're not exactly sure. So the way that Lamrim proceeds after having presented death and impermanence and precious human rebirth is by giving two main outlines. The first one is seeking a good rebirth for your next life, because obviously you're going to die from this life. So you have to start thinking about your next life. And having died, you have to consider the suffering of the lower migrations. So obviously, after we die, there are only two possibilities. One possibility is to have a good rebirth, and the other possibility is to have a bad rebirth. And in this context, the text goes into explaining the suffering that is associated with any of the three types of lower rebirths. So all this falls in the presentation of the individual of the small scope. Okay, so the thing is that once we pass away, once we die, we do not become non-existent. We do not disappear the same way that a rainbow disappears in the sky, for example. It is definite that we must take a rebirth, and we take a rebirth due to the power of karma and afflictions. So when we take rebirth in this way, it is imperative that actually our consciousness separates from the body. The gross body that we have is gross physical matter. It is something that was established through the sperm and the ovum of our parents. It is the body that we have sustained and maintained and fattened up through eating every day. But at the time of death, this is something that we have to leave behind. So whichever way the body is disposed, sometimes it is burned, is cremated, sometimes it is buried. The thing is, the body stays behind. But at that point, as we say, consciousness separates from the body. And it is this consciousness, this awareness that actually continues in the next life. So this consciousness is not something that is destroyed, is not something that it is burned when the body is cremated and so forth. So we know that consciousness continues. And actually, we have like a continuum of consciousness that goes from one life to the next. The way that we describe our existence is that it is beginningless, but at the end, there will be an end. Okay, beginningless means that up to here, if we keep going back, there are countless lifetimes. We cannot see the end. We cannot see the beginning of lifetimes. And actually, we don't have any way of knowing our previous lives. Only someone like Buddha Shakyamuni, who has complete omniscience, can look back and recognize all of his succession of lives. So what we say at the end, it is beginningless, but then for the individual person, there will be an end because we will reach the state of Buddhahood. Okay, so many people might think, because we talk about momentariness, we talk about impermanence in the level of momentariness, momentary disintegration, and so forth. So some people might come up with a question like, what happens to consciousness itself? Well, as we say, consciousness itself also is something that changes moment by moment. It is a continuum of many moments from the previous moment to the next, and it keeps going. So, for example, you have someone who has given birth to a child. So that is the mother. The mother has given birth to a child. And, as the time progresses, that child gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It grows, becomes like a 20-year-old, a 40-year-old, and so forth. So it is like this. We have continuity we have a stream of awareness. So as Buddhists, actually, we believe in past and future lives. You don't need to go to an astrologer. You don't need to have any more to tell you that you will have another life after this one. Actually, Buddha Shakyamuni has explained very clearly that the result of virtue will be a fortunate rebirth, and the result of non-virtue will be an unfortunate or lower rebirth. So this is very clear. So the way that we present this material in the Lam Rim is, first of all, we talk about death and impermanence, then we talk about refuge, then we talk about the law of cause and effect. But here we also introduce the subject of the suffering of the three lower migrations. And the reason for that is, if you speculate on that suffering, obviously you generate fear. And this fear, combined with faith and belief in the power of the three objects of refuge to protect you, can establish genuine refuge. Also, we generate a lot of faith in the law of cause and effect. Some people might think, why are we talking about the suffering of the three lower migrations? This seems to be irrelevant here. And why are we spending any time on this presentation? Actually, it's not irrelevant. It is very useful to consider the suffering of the lower migrations. When you talk about yourself, like myself, for example, when you say, I go for refuge. So when we talk about the self here, we're not talking about the object of negation. We're talking about the nominally existing self. So this nominally existing self is a person that must generate faith or trust in the law of cause and effect. All right. And what we have to consider is that this self, this person, me, for example, I already have accumulated countless imprints of negative actions. And even still now, continuously, I am creating new imprints of negative actions, right? And the result of all this negativity that I'm accumulating is to cause me to take rebirth in the lower migrations. No. So we know that we are coming to this life with a precious human rebirth. And this is actually the result of what we did in our previous life. So now the next question is, we must make sure, whilst we're in this life, that we will not have to experience the suffering of the lower migrations in our next life. So how do we achieve this? We must stop, we must eliminate all the causes that give rise to rebirth in the lower migrations, which is the 10 non-virtuous actions. And we must make sure that we establish the causes for a good migration, which is the opposite of the 10 non-virtuous actions. We have a means, we have a pathway to a good migration. So we know, according to the presentation of the practices that are shared with the individual of the small scope, their aim is to obtain a good rebirth as a god or a human. And the means for doing this is to actually maintain pure morality, engage in actions of pure morality. So, for example, making offerings with the mind of faith, practicing generosity, be patient, be kind to others, and so forth. The most important thing here in terms of practicing morality is to be mindful. Mindful here in the sense of being very quick to recognize when a negative state of mind arises. So, for example, you're becoming irritated, annoyed with others, you become jealous, for others, you generate the thought that you want to harm someone, and so forth. So it's very important to recognize this thought, this bad intention straight away, and apply an antidote, and instead cultivate an attitude that says, no, I will be patient towards others. I will be kind towards others. I don't want to harm anyone. I don't want to antagonize anyone, and so forth. Now, the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that if we give in to negative states of mind, so for example, we always have anger, we have attachment, we have jealousy in this life, the great danger is that these states of mind will also become manifest at the time of our death. And if we die within that state of mind of hatred, attachment, jealousy, and so forth, we will definitely get into a bad rebirth, right? So it's very important that we avoid this as much as possible and practice morality, abandoning the 10 non-virtuous actions. We will explain those in greater detail, but those 10 are broken down as 3 in relation to the body, 4 in relation to the speech, and 3 in relation to the mind. So it's very important to be aware and recognize the patterns that arise. So in general, let's say in society, there's got a lot of conversation that goes on without being very careful about what we say. And when you make comments like this about others, or when you hear comments that others make, it's very easy to generate attachment, to generate hatred, to create a mind that is disturbed, and so forth. And in a situation like this, it is very important that we stop and we analyze. We have plenty of opportunity to ask the question, and say, where does anger come from? Where does attachment come from? How does pride become manifest? It is in our hand to actually make this comparison. There is positive behavior and negative behavior. We can see that when we give into those negative states of mind, the mind becomes agitated, we're not peaceful, we cannot sleep at night, we get high blood pressure. We know that there are negative consequences of those things. Definitely, we can see that there are certain things that need to be abandoned and other things that should be adopted, because we can make the comparison between good and bad behavior. So the thing is that we see many cases every day of people who are not able to control their mind. Their mind becomes disturbed, these individuals become agitated, and so forth. Many of these people, they end up in the hospital, they go to be examined, they think something's wrong, physically wrong. And the doctor says, there's nothing physically wrong with you. And yet the person feels very unwell. The person feels quite upset and unwell. And when the mind is disturbed, what happens is, let's say, whatever faults we have from our side, we project them into others, or we think that other people look at us in, a negative way, in a bad way, or everyone is saying things behind our backs and things like this. So as a result of this, you can see people who are disturbed in this way. They cause a lot of harm to themselves. A lot of people commit suicide. They might harm other people in that state of mind, and so forth. So it is very important to have mindfulness and actually examine what is going on in your mind, what states of mind arise. Find a quiet time, a quiet place where you do this analysis, because you can be your own teacher. You can actually have this discussion with yourself and explain, look at the positive and the negative consequences of these choices. Okay, so we'll continue reading from our text. We are halfway, page 12. You may ask, if with the exception of Dharma, nothing helps at the time of death, then how does Dharma help and how does non-Dharma harm? So as it says here, with the exception of Dharma, nothing can be of help. We spend our whole lives accumulating material possessions, wealth, and so forth. But when the time of death comes, none of these material objects and the wealth and the and so forth can be of any benefit. Even this body that we have received from our parents and we have cherished dearly through our entire life, even that body has to be left behind. It's of no benefit. Everything has to be left behind. Only consciousness continues in the next life. So it says, with the exception of Dharma, nothing helps at the time of death. Then how does Dharma help? And how does non-Dharma harm? So when it talks here about non-Dharma refers to negativity, engaging in the 10 non-virtuous actions, and so forth. And they harm us because they throw us or they push us into the lower migrations of the animals, the hungry ghosts, and the hell beings. It says, at death, you do not simply evaporate. As I say, you don't become non-existent. It's not like you disappear like a rainbow in the sky. Death is followed by rebirth. And whether your rebirth is happy or miserable, high or low, is determined by the state of your mind at the time of death. Thus, except for the power of karma, ordinary people are powerless. Okay, so we do not have any power, we do not have any say, in the sense that, oh, in my next life now, I will be reborn in Singapore, or in my next life, I want to take rebirth in America. It's not determined by your own, wish or whim. Your next rebirth is determined through the power of karma that you have created, right? So it says, except from the power of karma, ordinary people are powerless. They take the rebirth propelled by the force of their positive and negative karma, the karmic seeds left by previous deeds of body, speech, and mind. Okay, so then it continues by explaining what are the actual causes that might bring you to a good rebirth or a lower rebirth. So it says they take rebirth propelled by the force of their positive and negative karma, the karmic seeds left by previous deeds of body, speech, and mind. If at the time of death a positive thought predominates, a happy rebirth will follow. If a negative thought predominates, one is born in one of the three lower realms where one suffers intensely. So, as we say, if you spend your entire life practicing ethics, morality, generating bodhicitta, generating renunciation, cultivating faith for the three jewels, if you act in this way, then you place quite a lot of virtuous imprints in your mind. Okay, so it means you will arrive at the time of death with a lot of virtuous imprints. If you act in the contrary way, you will arrive at the time of death with a lot of negative imprints. So whichever is predominant at the actual time of your death is the one that will push you to your next rebirth, either a good rebirth or a bad rebirth. It says, if a negative thought predominates, one is born into one of the three lower realms. So as an animal, as a hungry ghost, as a hell being, where one suffers intensely. There is a lot of negative karma. All right. So then it goes into explaining the suffering of the lower realms. Mm. Okay, so it says, what are the torments of the three lower realms? And then it gives a quote from Acharya Nagarjuna, probably is from the friendly letter. And you will see that in this quotation, there is presentation of the suffering of each one of the three types of lower rebirths. The question is, why do we elaborate on the suffering of the lower migrations? We elaborate because this indicates to you, like, the negative case, the worst case scenario, where you can end. And it is given there, so you can make the comparison and say, okay, this is the worst case scenario, and actually I don't want to experience this. So by knowing the negative, you can also understand the positive. And if you can understand the causes that bring about this negative type of rebirth with so much suffering, which is, of course, engaging in negative actions, then you could understand that the causes that establish better rebirths are practicing virtue. So then it comes up to the individual to say, oh, when a negative state of mind arises, I need to apply an antidote. I need to stop this. And instead, I need to take on as a practice cultivating positive states of mind. So we are describing the negative, so we can mentally make the comparison between the worst and the best rebirths. So it begins by saying, remember that in the lower hells, one burns like a sun. In the upper hells, one freezes. So he's talking here about rebirth in the hells. We know that we have 18 different types of hells. We have the 8 hot hells, the 8 cold hells, and then we have 10 neighboring hells. The line that talks about one burns like a sun is relevant to the hot hells. The one that says one freezes, it's a reference to the cold hells. The reason why we mention those things is to contemplate what might be the causes that bring about rebirth into those states. We understand that the causes is non-virtuous actions, is negativity. So you think that if I engage in a lot of negative action, I might end up being reborn there. I might have to experience those things. And therefore you start thinking, oh, I should abandon negative actions. I should practice something positive. So it is a form of analytical meditation where you try to examine what are the causes. And once you identify them, you start thinking, oh, I want to avoid those things. So we talk about the hells. The important thing to understand here is that the hells is not like a specific geographic location. Don't expect to find like a country called hell with a capital and so forth. We are born there as a result of our negative karma, isn't it? So if you create intense negativity, you pass away from this life, and then you pass through the bardo, the intermediate state, very, very quickly. And through the power of your negative actions, you are born in the hell existence, isn't it? Also, it could be the case of a medium-sized negativity, in which case you might spend longer time in the bardo, maybe 7 days, and then you will proceed to rebirth in the hells. So we talk about the hells. We said there are hot hells, cold hells, and so forth. We will not go into explaining each type of hell. They take quite a lot of time, this presentation. However, just just a short reminder or short description, if you want. At one point, Mongalipu went into the hells, and then he came back into this earth, and he said, "Oh, it's a terrible state. Even one spark from the hells will be enough to completely consume in flames our world, our existence," right? So when we talk about the suffering in the hot and the cold hells, we have to understand that this is something that we created through our own past karma. It's not that someone else created this for us. We have made this ourselves. So during our past lives or in this life, every time we engage in negativity, we create the causes for this hell type of existence. And in a sense, we're very fortunate because Buddha Shakyamuni has actually taught about the law of cause and effect. And we have that very clear presentation because there are a lot of people who are unaware of it. And you can see how people engage in really negative behavior, like abusing, enslaving, killing others, stealing from others, and so forth. So there is, we say that there are 18 types of hells, and from those 18, there is one hell that is called the hell of being revived. It is considered to be the lighter, the easier experience within the hells. So it comes from the smaller amount of negativity. So the karma of those who are born there is that they are born there in the aspect of humans, but when they go there, they do not recognize others like, let's say, relatives or friends and so forth. Immediately, as they see other beings in that hell, they raise weapons in their hands and they attack each other, they kill each other, they hack each other into pieces, right? And once they die and they're cut up in pieces, they hear a voice coming from the sky that says, now you should revive. And then all the pieces come together and they are revived, they're resurrected again. And then again, they attack each other and they kill each other again. So they might do this hundreds of times. during a day. So they do it again and again.
Mm-hmm.
Another type of hell is called the hell of black lines. The main reason to be reborn there, of course, is engaging the 10 non-virtuous actions, but in particular, punishing others. So as a result of this, you are born in this hell, and those black lines appear in your body. And then where those black lines are, other beings cut up your body in, according to the lines, the pattern in the lines, and so forth. The lifespan in those hells is extremely long, tens of thousands of years. Each hell existence has its own very long lifespan. So we need to consider that in this life, even if we are pricked by a needle, we consider this to be great suffering, right? So imagine if you had to undergo any of the sufferings that we describe here, how horrible it would be. So it's very important to consider the causes and think that I do not want to create the causes to be born there. Okay, so we are going to summarize a little bit. There is another hell, the hell where you have no rest. And this, actually, the main reason for that is consumption of alcohol. So Buddha Shakyamuni has actually talked a lot about the faults of drinking alcohol. He has seen it as something that can ruin the person. So consumption of alcohol is completely prohibited for the ordained, but even for the lay people, the Buddha has said that whoever is my follower should not even drink a dewdrop of alcohol, because it becomes a condition for you to engage in a lot of negative actions. So the people who consume too much alcohol and become totally intoxicated, like habitually, and also those who sell and facilitate the selling of alcohol end up in this particular hell. So then we can go into a presentation of the hot hells. As we say, there is the hotter hell, and so on and so forth. There are many types of hells. Actually, we don't have time to elaborate on each type. You can find this presentation in other Lam Rim texts. So the next one to be presented here in this quotation, in this text, is the suffering of the hungry ghosts. In other Lam Rim texts, you see first that they present the suffering of the hells, then the suffering of the animals, then the suffering of the hungry ghosts. But here is first the suffering of the hells, then the hungry ghosts, then the animals. Anyway, it's just a difference in the presentation. So, as it says here, remember that pretas and spirits suffer from hunger, thirst, and climate. Okay, so there is incredible suffering associated with the hungry ghosts. What is the main reason to be reborn there? The main reason is miserliness. So miserliness towards your own resources, not being willing to give anything away, even criticizing others who practice generosity, or stopping others from practicing generosity. So, for example, they see someone who wants to make an offering to the Sangha, and they say, oh, no, don't give. There's no point in giving, and so forth. Or even stealing the possessions of other people, and so forth. So as a result of this, they are born with a particular type of bodies. So the body is very big. They have a huge stomach, but they have very small throat, very narrow throat, and there might even be restrictions, almost like knots, 3 knots down the throat. So there was the case of this hungry ghost, and that is explained how she ended up with this type of rebirth. So in the past, when she was born as a human, someone came asking for some water, was very thirsty and asked for some water, and she wouldn't even give them a drop of water. And as a result of this incredible miserliness, she was born as a hungry ghost with 3 knots in her throat. The next line says, remember that animals suffer the consequences of stupidity. So it begins by talking about the suffering of animals. In terms of animals, we categorize them as those that live in the oceans and those that live above. So those that live in the ocean refer to different type of sea creatures who might live very deep in the ocean, in very dark places. They just feed on whatever is carried by the currents and so forth. Those who live above refers to the animals that live, for example, on the grounds, and the birds that fly. So, the animals that we usually see, the dogs, the cats, and, various animals. So the Lam Rim actually describes that they have 5 different types of suffering. Definitely, they suffer from eating each other, being chased and eaten by somebody else. They suffer from stupidity. They, of course, suffer from the environment, the heat, the cold of the environment, and so forth, and so on. So they experience a lot of suffering. So the question is, what is the main cause that can bring rebirth as an animal? So the main cause really is not keeping morality, not maintaining ethics. So all of those bad rebirths, they come from lack of morality. So if we continue, it says here, abandon the karmic causes of such misery and cultivate the causes of joy. So obviously it's talking about abandoning the negativity that is the cause for those lower rebirths with a lot of suffering, and instead establish the causes of virtue, that is the cause of joy and good rebirth. Human life is rare and precious. We know how difficult it is to establish the human rebirth. Do not make it a cause of pain. Take heed, use it well. So make sure you do not engage negativity. Make sure you control your mind and apply the antidotes whenever it is necessary. So as Nagarjuna implies, the suffering of the hot and cold hells are unendurable. The sufferings of hungry ghosts are horrendous. The suffering of animals, eating one another, being domesticated and ruled by humans, being unintelligent, and so forth, are overwhelming. So there's one interesting thing here. We talked about the hungry ghosts. The hungry ghosts are actually intelligent. If you were to teach Dharma to them, they could understand it and they could actually train in Dharma. However, there is no such chance with the animals. Doesn't matter how much you explain it, they will not understand it and they cannot train in Dharma. So there is that element of being unintelligent. Right now, you cannot hold your hand in fire even a few seconds. You cannot sit naked on ice in the winter for more than a few minutes. To pass even a single day without eating or drinking anything brings great difficulty, and merely a tiny bee sting seems terrible. How then will you be able to bear the heat or cold of the hells, the anguish of the pretas, and the horrors of animal existence? So right now, even if you were to hold like a piece of coal that is burning, you could just drop it immediately. You can't hold it in your hands. If you had to sit outside in the cold naked, again, you would not last for more than a few minutes. And even having one day without food and drink, you find it very difficult. So how would you endure the life of a preta, a hungry ghost, where they go for years and years without finding any food or anything to drink and so forth? So the thing is that we have no certainty whatsoever about not being reborn in any of those places. However, it is within our hands to follow the path that will establish causes that will bring a different type of rebirth. It is quite possible that when we hear the suffering of the hell beings, the hungry ghosts, the animals, we don't really associate with them, right? But let's say, of course, because we don't see much of this type of existence, of this suffering happening. So let's look at another example. War. Right now, there is war going on in different places in the world. But again, we look at this war and we know that every day many people die, but we don't necessarily have the close feeling when we hear those news or the description of how many people die. Okay. And we keep thinking, well, I don't have the karma to be involved in war. I don't have the karma to experience the suffering the killing and so forth that is involved in war. Okay, up to a degree, this is true. In this life, we don't have the karma to be involved to be in a war conflict, right? We live in a peaceful country. However, you could not say, I do not have the karma to experience the suffering of the hungry ghosts, or the karma to experience the suffering of the animals or the hell beings and so forth. And the reason for that is because over countless lifetimes, we have accumulated all those negative imprints that will lead into rebirth into those states. So although we feel I'm unaffected or it doesn't affect my life and so forth, the reality is we have many imprints for this type of rebirth. So it says, how then will you be able to bear the heat or cold of the hells, the anguish of the predators, all the horrors of animal existence? So it talks about the horrors, how we should be terrified by this type of suffering. And by doing this, actually, we should generate faith on the law of cause and effect. And then it continues by saying, meditate on the suffering of the lower realms until you're filled with dread and apprehension. So this is his fear. And now that you have gained an auspicious human form, abandon the causes of lower rebirth and cultivate the causes of a happy rebirth. Determine to apply yourself to the methods that cut off the path of the lower realms. So this is really the essential message of the Lam Rim. Now that you have met with a spiritual teacher, you have obtained the precious human rebirth, it is very important what you do with this type of precious human rebirth. It is very valuable, but the thing is that it is an impermanent type of rebirth. You could die at any minute. Impermanence was the first and the last teaching that the Buddha gave. With the first teaching, when the Buddha taught about the Four Noble Truths, he taught about impermanence. And in the last teaching, he taught how all compounded phenomena are impermanent and deteriorate. So the thing is that when we die, the only thing that is of benefit is Dharma. And when we die, it is certain that we have to be reborn. There are only two options. Either we will have a good rebirth or we will have a bad rebirth. And the thing is that it is completely, the pathway that leads to a good rebirth is completely within our grasps. On the basis of this body, we can practice proper morality, we can practice the ethics of abandoning the 10 non-virtuous actions. It is up to us to abandon the causes that bring about the suffering of the lower migrations and to establish the causes for a good rebirth. And therefore, as it says here, we have to strive, determine you to apply yourself to those things, right? You have to strive on those things. So we have the means for achieving all this. We know about the ethics of abandoning the 10 non-virtuous actions. And every day we can make the effort to reduce anger, attachment, and other forms of afflictions. And if we do this, we will establish happiness for this life and for future lives. We will progress along the path. We will develop renunciation, we will develop bodhicitta, we will develop the correct view, all the realizations of the path. We will progress along the path of accumulation, the preparation, path of seeing, path of meditation, path of normal learning. This is how we progress along the path. When we reach the state of patience within the path of preparation, this is the time where we gain the confidence that we will not be reborn again in the lower migrations. And obviously, from the path of seeing and beyond, it is impossible to be reborn there. Of course, if you are a bodhisattva, you might choose out of compassion to take rebirth in a lower migration to benefit beings there, but you're not thrown uncontrollably due to the force of karma. So it is very important that, as it says here, we apply ourselves to whatever are the means, the pathway that avoid negative rebirths and establish good rebirths. Okay, so we know very clearly here that the causes that bring about rebirths as a hell, as a hungry ghost, as an animal, is 10 non-virtuous actions. So we should try to maintain the morality that abandons these. Especially the specific cause that brings about rebirth as a hungry ghost, as we say, is miserliness. And therefore, we should make every effort to develop the practice of generosity. So with the practice of generosity, the important thing is the motivation. Whatever you give it without any attachment, right? So it's not about the substance or the value of the substance that you give. It's all about the motivation. Okay, some question?
Sheila, can I ask question related to the previous lesson? Okay, if we had life-threatening experience, how do we self-rescue? What will be the remedy on that moment?
So, for example, let's say you have a car accident
No, just
or
experience.
some
We
illness.
felt some kind of threaten to our life.
So there is some threat to your life. Okay,
Yes,
and
not externally like by other means, but just had the feeling of like something is going to happen to your life.
mhm.
Yeah. So I just want to know at that moment what can we do, like by chanting any mantras or any verses to
Okay.
self rescue. Yeah.
Okay, okay, okay. So yes, something like this might arise because we have to keep in mind that our body is actually established by the four elements, and sometimes the elements are out of balance. And when the elements are out of balance, it also affects the way that we think. But even if we even if there is some imbalance, it's there's no reason why we should become terrified or fear and so forth. Actually, this is quite common. What you describe is quite common. And if you ask other people also, occasionally have this fear. They feel frightened for their life. And not just humans, but other sentient beings as well. And some have even greater fears than this. Anyway, if this happens, the first thing that we have to do is to put the mind in a relaxed state. And the best method for doing this is focusing on the breath. So spend some time breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, because focusing on the breath, we know has this calming effect on the mind. It just controls, it pacifies the mind. And then once the mind is in a relaxed state, not terrified, then you can visualize the bodies of the Buddhas, you can recite some mantras, and so forth.